The file was called The Sterling Theory, and it had 47 tabs. Lyra Thorne knew this because she had built it herself, tab by tab, over the course of 2 years and 3 months. Not in a feverish, unhinged way. Not the way people imagined when they heard the word obsession, which was a word she refused to use, had always refused to use, even when the evidence stacked against her with the quiet, damning logic of a closing argument. She had built it the way other people built things. Carefully, deliberately, with a craftsman's patience and a researcher's discipline. A folder for Mary Sterling's public speeches, organized not by date, but by emotional register. Which ones she delivered like a verdict. Which ones she delivered like a prayer. A document tracking the evolution of her creative philosophy across 12 years of industry interviews. Color-coded annotations. Cross-references. A section titled, Contradictions, She Hasn't Resolved. Yet, that Lyra had always told herself was purely analytical. She was almost sure she believed that. If you've ever loved someone from a careful distance, or you're here for a romance that earns every single heartbeat, like this video and subscribe. This story is just getting started. The morning everything unraveled had started the way most catastrophic mornings do, without any indication at all. Lyra had arrived at Sterling & Co. at 7:52 a.m., 8 minutes before her personal self-imposed deadline, which was itself 22 minutes before anyone else on the creative team bothered to show up. This was not ambition, or at least, not only ambition. It was the particular luxury of someone who did her best thinking in the architecture of the office before it became inhabited. The clean geometry of empty desks, the uninterrupted hum of the ventilation system, the way the Manhattan skyline looked from the 45th floor when the early light was still going through its softer negotiations with the clouds. She liked the office before it was a performance. She liked most things before they became performances. She had stopped at the kitchen to make her coffee. Real coffee. Not the pod machine approximation that the rest of the team accepted with a resignation that she found quietly heartbreaking, and had spent 4 minutes doing this properly, because 4 minutes was the difference between a cup that was merely functional and a cup that made the first hour of the day feel survivable. Then she had gone to her desk, opened her laptop, and begun to do what she always did on Monday mornings, review the creative briefs that had come in over the weekend, cross-reference them with her notes on the client's historical preferences, and begin building the invisible scaffolding upon which someone else would eventually erect something that would get credited in an industry award. This was the texture of her professional life. She had made her peace with it, mostly. The email from Marcus Chen arrived at 8:14 a.m. It had no subject line, which should have been the first warning. Marcus never sent emails without subject lines. He was, if nothing else, a man who understood the theatrical value of a well-titled message. The email contained only 3 words and a meeting invite. You should know. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in conference room A, the big one, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the screen that took up an entire wall, the one they only used for client presentations, and apparently for whatever this was. Lyra stared at the 3 words for a long moment. She was not, by nature, a person given to foreboding. She was a person given to analysis, which was adjacent to foreboding but structurally different. Where foreboding was emotional and anticipatory, analysis was methodical and backward-looking. She analyzed. She observed. She documented. She had spent 2 years and 3 months documenting Mary Sterling with the same disciplined attention she brought to every creative problem she was given, which was perhaps the thing that should have troubled her more than it did. She closed the email, finished her coffee, and at 8:59 a.m., she walked into conference room A. The room was already full. This was the first wrong thing. Monday morning, all hands didn't start until 9:30. Whatever this was, it had been called outside the normal architecture of the week, which meant it was either very good or very bad, and the expression on Marcus Chen's face, pleasant in the practiced way of someone performing pleasantness, suggested it was the latter. He was standing near the head of the long conference table, his suit pressed to a severity that felt punitive, his hands folded in front of him like a man who had recently decided he was the protagonist of something. Marcus was 34 and had been at Sterling & Co. for 3 years, which was 1 year less than Lyra. He was technically her peer, occupying the same senior copywriter tier. But he navigated that equality with the sustained resentment of a man who had expected, by now, to be somewhere above it. He was talented in the way that some people are talented, fluently, efficiently, without much interiority. And he was ambitious in the way that made ambition ugly, which is to say he was ambitious in directions that required other people to be smaller. Lyra had known this about him for a long time. She had simply underestimated what he would do with it. Lyra? He said her name the way people say a name when they want you to understand that they have been waiting for you, specifically, which they have. Good morning. Glad you could join us. There were 7 other people in the room. The art director, Priya. 2 junior copywriters whose names Lyra always had to remind herself of. Jordan and Sam, or possibly Sam and Jordan. The head of accounts, Raphael. The office manager, Delia, who looked genuinely distressed, which was the detail that landed hardest, because Delia was a woman of extraordinary emotional equilibrium. And 2 people from HR, whose presence had the specific gravitational weight of a verdict already reached. There was no client. There was no brief. There was only the large screen at the far end of the room, currently dark, and the quiet that preceded something irreversible. Sit down, Marcus said, not unkindly. This was worse than unkind. I think we should just get into it. Marcus? Raphael's voice was careful. We talked about how this was going to go. We did, Marcus agreed, and something flickered behind his eyes. Something that Lyra recognized, in the way you recognize the shape of a wave before it arrives, as the specific pleasure of a person who has been patient for a very long time and is now, finally, allowed to be otherwise. And I think the most respectful approach is to be direct. Lyra, I want you to know that this is not personal. She almost laughed. The effort not to was substantial. What isn't personal? She asked, keeping her voice level, because she had spent years training her voice to be level, and the training held even when everything else was beginning to tilt. Marcus reached for the remote on the table. The screen behind him bloomed to life, and there it was. The Sterling theory was not, in the cold light of a conference room screen, as clinical as it had felt in the privacy of her own laptop. This was the first thing Lyra understood, with a slow and comprehensive horror, as the file spread across the wall in full resolution. The tabs visible along the top, the color-coded annotations bright against the white background. The section headers in the careful font she had chosen for readability, and now wished she had made less legible. Creative philosophy, evolution and contradiction. Public persona versus private methodology. The 14 campaigns that defined her aesthetic. Voice analysis, formal register versus unguarded register. Contradictions she hasn't resolved yet. That last one sat in the upper right corner of the screen like an accusation. The room was very quiet. Lyra became aware, in the particular way you become aware of things when your body is trying to manage an overload of information, of several things simultaneously. The sound of her own breathing, which she needed to regulate. The fact that Priya was looking at the table, and not at the screen. The fact that Delia had her hand pressed flat against the surface of the table, as if steadying something. And the fact that Marcus Chen was watching her with an expression that was trying to be neutral, but was, underneath the effort, quietly ecstatic. I found this on the shared creative server, Marcus said. I want to be clear. I wasn't looking for it. I was searching for the Hartley brief files, and this came up in the results. I brought it to HR because I felt it was my professional obligation. He paused, with the timing of a man who had rehearsed this. Because it's a file about Ms. Sterling. I know what it's a file about, Lyra said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She was almost proud of it. It's a very detailed file, one of the HR representatives said. Her name was Lisa, Lyra had met her once, at an onboarding event. "We've reviewed it, and we have some questions." "I'm sure you do." "Lyra." Raphael's voice, careful still, but now with something underneath it that might have been genuine concern. "Can you walk us through what this is?" She looked at the screen. She looked at 47 tabs. She looked at contradictions she hasn't resolved yet. "It's research," she said. "Research. Into Ms. Sterling's creative methodology. I use it to inform how I approach briefs, to understand what the agency's founding philosophy looks like in practice, so I can align my work with it." She heard how it sounded. She heard it clearly, from the outside, with the particular precision of someone who had just stepped outside herself and was watching the scene from a terrible distance. "I know how it looks." "How does it look?" Marcus asked, and she could hear, buried in the question like a splinter, that this was the moment he had been waiting for. She looked at him directly. "Like something it isn't." The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The HR representatives asked their questions with a professionalism that she almost appreciated, because professionalism was at least a kind of dignity. Raphael asked his with the careful kindness of a man who genuinely didn't know what to do with what he was looking at. Marcus asked none. He had already done his work, and he sat with the particular stillness of someone who has deployed something and is now simply waiting for it to land. Priya never looked up from the table. At the end of the 40 minutes, the HR representative said they would need to escalate the matter to Ms. Sterling directly, and that Lyra should not discuss the file or its contents with anyone in the office while the review was ongoing. Lyra said she understood. She gathered herself, which was not a metaphor, or not entirely. It was the physical act of arranging her posture and her expression into something that could walk out of conference room A without collapsing. And she walked out. She went to the bathroom. She stood at the sink for a long time, looking at herself in the mirror with the focused attention of someone trying to identify exactly what was wrong with a photograph. She didn't cry. She had learned, a long time ago, that crying at work was a form of self-disclosure she couldn't afford. Not because it was weak. She had long since made her peace with the idea that crying was not weakness, but because it was legible, and she was not prepared, at this particular moment, to be legible to anyone. She went back to her desk. She worked for the rest of the day with the disciplined focus of a person who has decided that the only available response to humiliation is competence. She answered emails. She revised 2 taglines. She ate half a sandwich at her desk and threw the other half away because her body, apparently, had opinions about what was happening that her mind had not caught up to yet. At 6 o'clock, she put on her coat and took the elevator down 45 floors and walked out into Manhattan, which received her with its customary indifference, the grinding traffic and the smell of rain-damp pavement, and the particular density of Tuesday evening foot traffic that parted around her like a river around stone. She walked home, 32 blocks, which she knew was impractical and didn't care, because she needed the distance, literal, physical distance from the building, and she needed the cold air, and she needed the city to be loud around her so that the inside of her head didn't have to be. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in the West 30s that had good bones and ambitious radiators and a view of the building across the street, which had a rooftop water tower that she had always found, for reasons she had never fully articulated, privately beautiful. She made dinner, pasta with olive oil and garlic and the end of a block of Parmesan that she had been rationing with a thriftiness that would have appalled Mary Sterling, who, according to tab 17 of the Sterling theory, believed that good cheese should never be rationed. She ate standing at the kitchen counter, which was a habit she had never managed to break, and she read 40 pages of a novel that she had been reading for 3 weeks, and she told herself that she was fine, which she mostly believed. She was in bed by 10:15. She was not asleep. The phone rang at 0:07. She knew the time because she had been watching the ceiling with the focused attention of someone who has given up on sleep but has not yet accepted this fact formally, and the clock on her nightstand was visible from the corner of her eye. 0:07. Which meant she had been in bed for almost 2 hours, and the ceiling had provided exactly as much comfort as she had expected. which was none. The phone rang. Lyra reached for it without looking, because it was probably her sister Cora calling from Portland, where the time difference made midnight phone calls something Cora considered reasonable. Cora called at midnight with the comfortable assumption that Lyra would not be asleep, which was, to Lyra's ongoing ambivalence, almost always correct. She looked at the screen. It was not Cora. The name on the screen was one she had not programmed herself. It had been added to her phone during the onboarding paperwork 2 years and 3 months ago, along with 11 other executive contacts, in case of a creative emergency. She had never expected to see it light up her screen in her own dark bedroom at 7 minutes past midnight, the night after the worst professional day of her adult life. M. Sterling, CEO, Sterling & Company. Lyra stared at it for 3 full rings. Then she answered. Ms. Thorne. The voice was exactly what she'd expected, and nothing she was prepared for. She had heard Mary Sterling speak dozens of times. In all-hands meetings and client presentations and the hallway encounters that Lyra had always navigated by becoming as architecturally inobtrusive as possible. But she had never heard her voice at midnight, stripped of the conference room and the $300 blazer in the audience. She had never heard her voice without its public geography. It was lower than usual, not soft, exactly. Lyra was not sure Mary Sterling was capable of soft, and she had given this more thought than was strictly wise, but stripped of its performance layer. The kind of voice that existed in the space between who you were at work and who you were when you weren't anywhere in particular. Ms. Sterling, Lyra said. Her voice came out level. The training held, even now, even here. A pause. Not uncomfortable, or at least not uncomfortable in the usual way. It had the quality of a pause that was itself a kind of assessment. I read the file, Mary said. Lyra closed her eyes, opened them. The ceiling remained its reliable self. All of it? All 47 tabs. Another pause. Lyra could hear, faintly, something in the background. The ambient soundscape of a space that was large and quiet and expensive, which she had always imagined Mary Sterling's apartment would be. You have very good organizational instincts. This was so far from what Lyra had expected her to say that she spent a moment simply processing it, the way you process a word in a language you know but rarely encounter. Methodically, deliberately, pulling the meaning out of the shape. Thank you, she said, because she didn't know what else to say, and because it was, she supposed, a compliment, delivered in the particular currency of a woman who did not distribute compliments carelessly. The color coding is intuitive, Mary continued, and there was something in her voice that Lyra couldn't quite read, something that might have been amusement, or might have been curiosity, or might have been something else entirely, something that didn't have a clean name. I would have organized the speech analysis differently, but your reasoning for the emotional register approach is sound. You would have organized it chronologically, Lyra said, and then immediately wondered if she should have said that, and then decided that she had said it, and that the gap between saying a thing and unsaying it was absolute. A beat. Yes, Mary said. I would have, and I would have been wrong. She said this without apology, which was, in Lyra's experience of her, entirely consistent. Mary Sterling was one of those rare people who could acknowledge error without it costing them anything. Not because they didn't care about being wrong, but because they had long since decided that accuracy was more valuable than the performance of infallibility. Why emotional register? Because chronology tells you what someone said and when, Lyra said, and she was aware, with a part of herself that was slightly outside the conversation, that she was speaking about Mary Sterling's own speeches to Mary Sterling herself, in her dark bedroom, at 7 minutes past midnight, and that this was the most surreal conversation she had ever participated in. Emotional register tells you how she was feeling when she said it, whether she believed it, whether she was afraid, whether she was performing, or whether she was... She stopped. Whether I was what? Mary asked, and her voice had gone quieter, not softer, in the way of water that has found a depth. Present, Lyra said. Another pause. Longer this time. Long enough that Lyra wondered briefly if she had said the wrong thing, if the call was about to end, if she was about to hear the specific sound of a CEO deciding she had heard enough. The section called Contradictions She Hasn't Resolved Yet, Mary said. Yes. There are 11 entries. 12, Lyra said. I added one last week. She heard something then, not quite a laugh, not quite a breath, something that lived in the register between them. What's the 12th? Lyra looked at the ceiling. She talks about work-life integration in every public interview. She has for 8 years. She uses the phrase sustainable creative practice, and she talks about the importance of rest and recovery and protecting the conditions for long-term excellence. She paused. She gets to the office before 7 every morning, and she doesn't leave until 9 at night, and she answers emails at 1 a.m., and she has not taken a vacation in 4 years. Silence. That's not a contradiction, Mary said finally. That's hypocrisy. I know. That's why it bothered me enough to document. Another beat. Then, why did it bother you? This was the question Lyra had not anticipated, and she sat with it for a moment. Sat with it in the way she sat with all difficult things, turning it in her mind, looking at it from its various angles, trying to find the cleanest way through. Because she's very good at seeing the right thing, Lyra said carefully. And I think she knows what it would look like to live it. And I think she's afraid of it. And... She stopped again. And? Mary's voice was quiet in a way that felt dangerous. Or perhaps the word was significant. Dangerous and significant being, in Lyra's experience, close cousins. And I think someone who can see the right thing that clearly shouldn't have to be afraid of it, Lyra said. It seemed like a waste. The silence after that was different. It had texture. It had weight. It was the silence of something that had been said, and could not be unsaid, but which had been received by someone who had not, apparently, decided yet how to hold it. Ms. Thorne, Mary said. Lyra. A pause. Lyra. She said the name with the same precision with which she said everything, and the precision landed differently than Lyra had expected, which was to say that it landed. I'm not calling to tell you you're fired. Lyra breathed. I had gathered that. I'm calling because I have a question. All right. The file, Mary said. In the introduction, which you didn't have to write, but which is very well written, I want to be clear. You say that the purpose of the document is to understand the operating system beneath the public interface. Your words. My words. What made you think there was an operating system worth understanding? Lyra was quiet for a long moment. The radiator ticked. The city hummed its insomniac hum outside the window. The Caldwell pitch, she said finally. 3 years ago. The Caldwell campaign brief. The big retail account. They wanted aspirational but accessible, and everyone in the room was taking them at their word. And you stopped the presentation. She could remember this with the clarity of something that had mattered before she knew it mattered. You were about 10 minutes in and you put up your hand and you said, they're not asking for aspirational. They're asking for permission. And the whole room went quiet because nobody knew what that meant yet. But you did, and you let them sit with it for 30 seconds before you explained. You let them understand it for themselves first. She paused. That's not a technique you learn. That's a kind of patience. I wanted to understand where it came from. The silence that followed was long. Longer than the others. Lyra counted to 14 before Mary spoke again. It's late, Mary said. It is. I'll call you tomorrow. This was a strange thing to say, and Lyra received it strangely, as a thing that was probably a dismissal and possibly something else, the two categories not being mutually exclusive. All right, she said. Good night, Lyra. Good night, Ms. Sterling. A click. The call ended. The screen went dark. Lyra put the phone down on her chest and looked at the ceiling, and the ceiling looked back, offering nothing, which was all it had ever offered, and which was, she supposed, exactly what she needed from it right now. She fell asleep at 1:23 a.m., which she knew because she checked the time before she closed her eyes, the way she had always done, the way her mind needed to file the information before it could let go of the day. She dreamed nothing that she remembered. In the morning, she went to work. This required more than the usual internal negotiation. She sat at the edge of her bed at 6:45 and had a conversation with herself that was brief and not particularly kind, the kind of conversation you have when you need to locate the specific point in your own spine where your refusal to surrender lives, and you're not entirely sure you'll find it where you left it. She found it. She always did. It was one of the few things she was reliably confident about. The office was different, and it was the same. The 45th floor received her with its usual indifferent elegance. Glass and steel and the particular quality of air that building's ventilation system produced, which Lyra had always thought smelled faintly of ambition and dry cleaning. She went to the kitchen. She made her coffee with the same 4-minute discipline. She went to her desk. Marcus Chen was already there, which meant he had been watching for her. He had never, in 3 years, arrived before 8:45. He was very carefully not looking at her, which was a form of looking at her. She sat down, opened her laptop, and began working. Nobody said anything to her for the first 2 hours. This was, in its own way, a form of statement. The particular eloquence of people who have decided that the least dangerous course of action is to behave as if something hasn't happened. Priya caught her eye once, across the open floor, and the look she gave her was complicated in a way that Lyra filed away without analyzing, because she was trying to be careful today about what she filed. The morning passed. She worked. She revised. She turned in a retail tagline that she knew was better than it needed to be, because she was not capable of doing work that was less than what it should be, even when, especially when, she was angry. And she was, she recognized, quietly and carefully angry. At 11:30, an email arrived. From M. Sterling to L. Thorne. Subject, this evening. I'll call at 10. Be available. MS. Lyra read it twice. Then she read it a third time, which did not reveal anything new, but provided the small satisfaction of thoroughness. She typed, "Understood. LT." She sent it. Then she stared at her screen for a moment, aware that she had just agreed to something without knowing what she had agreed to, which was not, historically, how she operated. She went back to work. Mary called at 10, and then she called the night after that, and then the night after that. The pattern established itself with the quiet insistence of things that are becoming structure before they are named as such. A Tuesday, a Wednesday, a Thursday, each call arriving between 10 and midnight, sometimes closer to 10, and sometimes closer to the other side of it, and each call lasting somewhere between 40 minutes and 2 hours, a range that Lyra would have found more alarming if she had been less honest with herself about the fact that she was not counting down to them. She was not counting down to them. She was simply aware, in the early evenings, of a particular quality of attention that the hours had, the way they moved with a specificity that undifferentiated hours did not move with. This was, she told herself, the normal experience of a person who was expecting a phone call. This was not a meaningful distinction from other phone calls. This was... She stopped telling herself these things sometime around the 4th night, because they had become, structurally, less reassuring than their absence. The calls were unlike anything she had experienced professionally or otherwise. They were not friendly exactly. Mary Sterling was not a person who operated in the register of friendliness, which Lyra had documented. Tab 9, Public Persona versus Private Methodology. with the observation that she was warm in the way of a stone that has been in the sun, not producing its own heat, but genuinely capable of giving it. She was curious. She asked questions in the way of someone who is genuinely interested in the answers, which is different from the way of someone who is performing interest, and Lyra had spent enough time around both kinds to know the difference. "Tell me about the 14 campaigns," Mary said on the third night. The section called "The 14 Campaigns That Defined Her Aesthetic." "You have them ranked." "I do." "Ranked by what criterion?" "Conceptual courage," Lyra said. "Not commercial performance. I was clear about that in the methodology note. Some of the most courageous ones performed modestly. I ranked them by how far the concept pushed past the client's comfort zone while still being rooted in something true about them. And you put the Ferraro wine campaign last." 14th, Lyra confirmed. "Out of 14. That campaign won 3 Clios. I know. It was considered groundbreaking." "It was technically excellent," Lyra said, choosing her words with the precision she always brought to difficult distinctions. "The execution was beautiful, but the concept was safe. It said what everyone already believed about the brand and said it gorgeously, and there's real skill in that, but it didn't push anything. It didn't—" She paused, looking for the right word. "It didn't risk anything," Mary said. "No. A beat. I like that campaign. I know you did. You've said so in 3 separate interviews. And you think I was wrong." "I think you were comfortable with it," Lyra said, which was, she had decided, a more precise distinction than wrong. "Which is different. You were tired that year. The agency was going through the partnership restructure. I think you needed a win you could hold, and that was a win you could hold. I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying I understand why you loved it, and it wasn't for the reasons you gave in the interviews." Silence. Not the silence of offense, she had learned by this point to distinguish them, but the silence of something being genuinely processed. "What reasons did I give in the interviews?" Mary asked, and her voice was careful. "That it represented a new approach to heritage brand storytelling, that it broke conventions of wine advertising by refusing to aestheticize the product." Lyra let a beat pass. "Both true. Neither of them the real reason." "And the real reason?" "It reminded you of the first campaign you ever did," Lyra said. "The Caldwell thing in 2011, before the agency was yours. The client was a small Italian restaurant in the Bronx, and the brief was essentially, make people feel like their grandmother cooked this. You've never talked about that campaign publicly, but it shows up in a footnote in a 2019 Addy Week profile where you mention it as the one that taught you what food advertising was actually about. The Ferraro campaign had the same emotional grammar. You loved it because it rhymed." The silence was very long. "Miss Thorne," Mary said. "Lyra." "Lyra." And again the name landed with a precision that Lyra had stopped trying to analyze because the analysis wasn't leading anywhere useful. "When did you find the 2019 Ad Week footnote?" "About 6 months into building the file. And you connected it to the Ferraro campaign. It wasn't a difficult connection. Once you know the emotional grammar someone uses, you start to see it everywhere. It's like—" She searched for the right analogy. "It's like learning someone's handwriting. After a while, you can recognize it even when they've tried to write differently." Another pause. Lyra could hear in the background the sound of something. Glass, maybe, being set down on a hard surface. "Nobody has ever—" Mary started and stopped. "Ever what?" "Read me," Mary said, and her voice, for just a moment, lost something. Not collapsed. She was not a person who collapsed. Not even partially. Not in Lyra's experience of her, which was admittedly lopsided and conducted largely from a distance. But something moved underneath it. Something brief and real, like a current visible only for a moment at the surface of very deep water. With that kind of— She paused again. with that kind of care. Lyra was quiet for a moment. The file wasn't a violation, she said finally. Not because she thought Mary believed it was. She didn't think Mary had called every night for a week because she thought the file was a violation, but because she needed to say it plainly, for her own clarity, if nothing else. I know it looked like something it wasn't, but it was the closest thing I knew how to do to telling someone they were worth paying attention to. The silence after that was the longest one yet. I know, Mary said, and her voice was very quiet and entirely real. On the 7th night, Mary called at 11:45 and said without preamble, "I need you to come on a trip with me." Lyra was at her kitchen counter, eating cereal, which was the dietary decision of a person who had not gone to the grocery store in 5 days and was running low on the architecture of a real meal. She set the spoon down. "A trip," she said, "the Whitmore account." Mary's voice had shifted back to its professional register, the smooth, decisive terrain of someone who had decided something and was now simply notifying the world of this fact. "They've been difficult for 18 months, and I've been approaching it wrong. I need to spend a week at the property. There's a house in the Hudson Valley, a retreat space. I need to think it through, and I need someone with me who can—" She paused. "Who can think?" "There are 12 senior creatives at the agency," Lyra said. "I'm asking you." "Marcus." "I'm aware of my options, Lyra, and I'm asking you." A pause, shorter than usual. "Unless you have a reason not to come." Lyra looked at her cereal. She looked at the clock on the microwave, which read 11:47. She looked at the dark window and the water tower across the street, which was lit by a light she had always thought of as amber, but was probably technically more gold, and which she had looked at from this exact position more nights than she could count. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Saturday," Mary said. 7 a.m. I'll send a car. I have my own transportation." "I know you do. I'll send a car." Lyra almost argued. She decided against it. "All right," she said. "Good night, Lyra." "Good night, Ms. Sterling." The call ended. Lyra picked up her cereal spoon and sat with it for a moment, not eating, looking at the middle distance in the way of someone who has just agreed to a thing and is now beginning to understand the shape of what they've agreed to. She finished her cereal. She washed the bowl. She went to her room and lay down on her bed and looked at the ceiling. She did not think about Mary Sterling. Or she thought about Mary Sterling in the way you think about a storm that has not arrived yet. Not directly. Not with the kind of attention that would be too expensive, but as a presence at the edge of the horizon that you're aware of without turning toward. She was asleep by 12:40. She was ready at 6:52 on Saturday morning, which was 8 minutes before the car was due to arrive, because 8 minutes was the correct buffer, and because she had been awake since 5:15, which she would not have predicted and refused to assign meaning to. She had packed for a week with the efficient minimalism she brought to everything. 3 days of clothing doubled up, 2 pairs of shoes, the notebook she always carried, dark green, unlined, purchased in a specific shop in the Flatiron district that sold only things made to last. 2 books she had been meaning to read, and her laptop. She had not packed anything she didn't need. She had debated the second book for 4 minutes, and decided the presence of 2 was more honest than the performance of 1. The car was a black town car with a driver named Francis, who had the admirable quality of knowing when a passenger wanted conversation and when they wanted silence. He had taken one look at Lyra in the rearview mirror as she settled into the back seat with her bag and immediately decided, correctly, on silence. They drove through the near-empty early Saturday streets of Manhattan, which was a city that looked entirely different before 9 in the morning on a weekend. Quieter, more honest. The scaffolding of its daily performance not yet erected. The streets wide and clean in a way they would not be again until this time next week. Francis drove uptown, and then over, and then north, and as the city began to give way to the geometry of the highway, Lyra watched it go with the particular attention she always gave to transitions. She was thinking, if she was being honest with herself, about Mary Sterling's voice at 11:45 at night. She was thinking about the 7th call, and what had been said in it, and what had been said in all the calls before it, and the architecture of what was being built between them, call by call, which she still did not have clean language for. She was a person who needed clean language for things. The absence of it was not comfortable. She was also, if she was still being honest, slightly terrified. Not of Mary Sterling exactly, or not only of Mary Sterling. She was terrified of the particular configuration that seemed to be forming, a configuration in which she had been seen seeing, in which the seeing had been acknowledged, in which the acknowledgement had opened something that she was not at all sure could be closed again. She had spent 2 years and 3 months observing Mary Sterling from the careful distance of professional anonymity. She had thought of herself as the observer, the still point around which the more visible world moved. She had not anticipated being turned, slowly and precisely, into someone who was also being observed. She had not anticipated that it would feel like this. The car exited the highway somewhere past Yonkers, taking the route north that wound through the river towns, Tarrytown, Ossining, Cold Spring, small places strung along the Hudson like beads on a thread, each one with its own syntax of old houses and water, and the particular quiet of somewhere that had stopped trying to be anything other than what it was. Lyra had not been north of the city in almost a year. She had forgotten that this was what the world looked like when you gave it enough distance from Manhattan, wider, slower, with room for the sky to be a full thing instead of a strip between buildings. At some point, she fell asleep against the window. She was aware of this happening, but was too tired to prevent it, the 5:15 wake-up having accumulated its due, and when she surfaced back into consciousness, it was because the car had slowed, was moving along a narrower road now, tree-lined and dappled in the particular soft light of a late morning in early October. And then the car turned, and gravel crunched under the tires, and there was a house. Lyra had not known what to expect of a house belonging to Mary Sterling, and then she had known exactly what to expect. And then she had reminded herself that she did not actually know anything about this house, because the file, comprehensive as it was, did not include a section on Mary Sterling's preferred weekend real estate, a gap she had not thought to fill, and was now regretting. But the house was not what she had built in her imagination, which had gone, apparently, in the direction of something architectural and aggressively modern, a piece of glass and steel that made a statement about its owner from 50 meters away. The actual house was old, white clapboard with dark green shutters, tucked into a hillside with the quiet confidence of something that had existed before anyone thought to have an opinion about it. It had a porch, a real one, with boards that looked like they would creak in a satisfying way. There was a garden on the side that had been tended recently, but not obsessively, which spoke of someone who cared about it without needing it to be perfect. Lyra climbed out of the car and looked at the house for a moment. The front door opened. Mary Sterling was wearing jeans. This was, Lyra would process this later, in the privacy of her own interior, with the thorough attention it deserved. This was something that the file had not prepared her for. Not because she hadn't known in the abstract that Mary Sterling owned and presumably wore jeans, but because she had encountered her, exclusively, in the context of the 45th floor and its adjacencies, in the visual language of tailored excellence, that was as much a part of Mary Sterling's professional identity as the quality of her thinking. She had built a comprehensive picture of this woman over 2 years and 3 months, and the picture had not included this. The dark wash of a well-worn pair of jeans, a cream-colored sweater that looked like it had been purchased for its practicality and had survived long enough to become a favorite. Hair down and slightly wind-disordered in a way it was never allowed to be in Manhattan. She looked. Lyra stopped herself. "You slept most of the way," Mary said from the porch. Her voice was different here too. Same voice. But the same voice outdoors was different from the same voice in a conference room. Or perhaps what was different was the absence of the conference room around it. "I was up early," Lyra said. She pulled her bag from the car. Frances nodded to her and began the process of turning the car around, and then it was just the two of them and the house, and the sound of wind in the trees, which were beginning to turn. Just beginning, the first suggestion of orange at the edges of the maples, and the specific quiet of a place that was not performing anything. "Come in," Mary said. She turned back toward the door, and Lyra followed her across the porch. The boards did creak satisfyingly, and through the door and into the house. The house was warm, and it smelled of coffee and old wood, and the particular smell of a fireplace that had been recently used, and it was— Lyra took this in carefully, the way she took everything in carefully. It was beautiful in the way of things that had not been designed to be beautiful. There were books on shelves that looked like they had been read. There was a kitchen with a table that had been marked by years of use. There was a window seat that faced the garden, and the window had the wavy quality of old glass, and the light came through it with a softness that modern windows refused. "Coffee?" Mary asked, already at the kitchen counter. "Please. I make it strong." "Good." Mary poured 2 cups with the economical precision of someone who has performed this action thousands of times and stopped thinking about it. She set one on the table and sat down with the other, and Lyra sat across from her. And for a moment they were simply 2 people sitting at a kitchen table with coffee, which was, given everything, the most disorienting thing that had happened yet. "The file," Mary said. Lyra waited. "I want to finish going through it." She said this without looking up from her cup, and Lyra recognized the quality of not looking up as the particular way Mary Sterling delivered things that she had decided to say, but had not entirely decided to be watched saying. "I've read through it twice. There are things in it I want to discuss with you directly." "All right," Lyra said. "Not as a—" She paused, seemed to be choosing something. "Not as a professional exercise? As—" Another pause. "Because I want to." Lyra wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and let the warmth of it work its way into her palms. "All right," she said again. Mary looked up then, and they looked at each other across the table. And whatever Lyra had expected the first time Mary Sterling looked at her directly like this, which was not in a meeting, not in passing, not with the particular quality of someone who was looking at a room and you happened to be in it, but at her, with the same attention she would give a thing worth examining, whatever she had expected it to feel like. She had been wrong about it. It felt like being recognized. Not the way you were recognized from a distance, or the way your work was recognized, or the way your usefulness was recognized. It felt like being recognized as the specific person you were, in the specific arrangement you occupied in the world, without reduction or simplification. She had not felt this before. Not quite like this. Not with this particular quality of— She breathed. She picked up her coffee. She did not say anything, because there was nothing to say yet, and she was a person who understood that not all silences needed to be filled. Mary Sterling looked at her for one more moment, and then she looked back at her coffee and something that had been tightly held in the set of her shoulders, something that Lyra had not consciously identified as tension until it began to ease. Let go, just slightly, just at the edges. Outside, the October wind moved through the turning maples, and the old house held them both in its careful quiet, and somewhere under the surface of everything that had been said and not said and documented and discovered and called about at midnight, something was beginning, not with the drama of arrival, but with the quieter, deeper certainty of a door that had been standing unlocked for a very long time, finally opened by someone who had the right key without knowing it.